The dim, flickering lights of the Drathak outpost barely cut through the heavy haze of recycled air. The low hum of distant engines and the occasional clank of unseen machinery created a constant backdrop of noise, but tonight it felt different, heavier, almost suffocating. In the far corner of the common area, a group of Drathaki soldiers sat around a single weak light source, the blue hue of its glow casting long shadows on their scaled faces. The shadows seemed to pulse with the unease that filled the room. None of them spoke, save for Prax, whose voice was little more than a whisper, as if even speaking of it too loudly might draw unwanted attention. "You've heard the stories, right?" Prax began, his voice trembling slightly. "Out on the rim, in the dark spaces where even the light of the stars barely reaches, they say there's something out there, something that doesn't belong." Renan leaned back, unimpressed, his sharp claws drumming against the cold metal table. "Every sector has its ghost stories, Prax. Pirates, rogue AI, get to the point." Prax's eyes flickered to the shadows around them, as if expecting something to leap from the darkness. "This is different. There are creatures, beings that no one's ever seen and lived to tell about it. Some say they're survivors from a world so hostile it's a wonder anything can live there at all. A death world." The others exchanged uneasy glances, but Renan remained skeptical. "A death world? That's ridiculous. No world could be that dangerous." Prax ignored the interruption, his voice lowering further, becoming almost conspiratorial. "The few who've seen them say they don't look like us. Nothing like us. Their skin, it's soft but unbreakable. Their eyes burn like stars and they move like predators. They walk in places where no sentient being should. They live in poisoned air under skies filled with lethal radiation, and they thrive in it." Virax, sitting opposite Prax, snorted, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of discomfort. "Thriving in poisoned air? Come on, Prax. You've been reading too much rim trash. No species could survive that." Prax leaned in closer, his breath almost misting in the cool air. "That's just it. They don't just survive. They conquer. Planets on the edge of the galaxy, ones we thought were lost to space, have gone dark. The only signs of life left are whispers. Whispers of them. The ones who come from the shadows, from that cursed place, and never leave witnesses behind." A tense silence filled the room. No one spoke for a long moment. Even Virax, usually the first to dismiss Prax's wild stories, seemed unusually quiet. Renan finally broke the silence, though his voice was lower, less certain than before. "And what are they called, these creatures?" Prax's eyes darkened as he spoke, the words hanging heavy in the air. "They don't have a name, not really. But the Rimworlders call them the Humans, monsters from a dead world, and wherever they come, death follows." Their conversation was suddenly cut short as the proximity alarm went off. "Come on," Virax said as he stood up. "We can talk more about Prax's ghost stories after we investigate whatever just entered our airspace." Hours later, the search had dragged on through the night. Patrol ships circled the area where the object was believed to have fallen, and teams combed the rough terrain, scanning the skies and ground for any sign of the impact. "Anything?" Virax's voice crackled through the comms, frustration growing as the minutes ticked by. "Nothing yet," came the reply from one of the search teams. "No debris, no energy signatures. We might have been tracking a glitch." Just as the crew prepared to abandon the search, a soft ping echoed through the system. "Wait," a voice called over the comms, breathless. "I've got something. Small, metallic, approximately 2 clicks northeast." The team rushed toward the coordinates, eyes scanning the rocky surface of Telavara 9. It wasn't long before they spotted it. A small, half-buried escape pod, its exterior scorched from re-entry but mostly intact. Prax was the first to reach it, his heart racing as he crouched beside the pod's entrance. His clawed hands traced the alien markings along its surface, markings he didn't recognize. "Open it," Renan muttered, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. With a sharp hiss, the pod's door slid open, releasing a wave of cold air. Inside, a single figure lay unconscious, crumpled against the far wall. A humanoid figure. Soft skin, muscled limbs, and though it was unconscious, there was something unmistakably dangerous about it. Prax's breath caught in his throat. He whispered the word before he even realized it had left his lips. Human. Renan shook his head immediately, scoffing. "No, there's no way. Humans are myths, Prax. This is just some unknown species we haven't catalogued yet." Prax stared at the figure in the pod, his mouth dry. "But the stories." "They're stories," Renan snapped, his voice tense. "This isn't some monster from a death world, it's just another species from the Rim. We find new ones all the time. It's probably an escapee from a forgotten transport or something. A fluke." Virax hesitated, his gaze lingering on the figure in the pod. There was something about it, something primal, that sent a chill down his spine, but he shook the feeling away. Renan was probably right. Myths had a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially in the cold, empty reaches of space. "We're reporting this to command," Virax said, his voice steady as he stepped back from the pod. "Unknown species, crash landing on Talavara 9, nothing more." Prax glanced between Virax and the unconscious figure, his stomach churning with uncertainty. "But what if—" Virax cut him off. "We bring it back to base, let the higher-ups deal with it. It's not our place to speculate. And don't start with the human nonsense, Prax. There's no such thing." Renan nodded in agreement, but Prax couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at him, as they began the process of retrieving the escape pod. He knew what they were all thinking, even if they wouldn't admit it aloud. There was something about this, something familiar, in the worst way. The Brig was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the energy shields surrounding the escape pod. The alien markings on the pod's surface seemed to shimmer under the low light, but beyond that it had remained still since they had brought it in. Virax, Renan, and Prax stood around the control console, their gazes locked on the pod. None of them spoke. It had been several cycles since the recovery crew had brought the object back to the base. They were still waiting for the transport to arrive and take whatever was inside away. Until then, all they could do was watch. And wait. "Anything?" Virax finally broke the silence, his voice a low murmur. His sharp eyes flicked to the console, where the scanners displayed nothing unusual. No spikes in energy, no signs of movement. Renan shook his head. "Still nothing. Whatever it is not in any hurry to make itself known." Prax, standing slightly apart from the others, couldn't take his eyes off the pod. His scales twitched with unease. "We should have left it where we found it," he muttered under his breath, though none of his comrades seemed to hear. Suddenly, a faint creaking sound echoed through the brig. All three of them stiffened, their attention snapping to the pod. The noise had come from inside. It was subtle, like metal shifting, but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" Renan asked, his voice tight. Virax nodded slowly, his gaze narrowing. "Yeah. Check the readings again." Renan quickly tapped on the console, his fingers flying over the controls, but the screen remained steady. Nothing. No movement, no energy spikes. The creaking sound grew louder, more persistent. It echoed off the walls of the brig, sending a chill through the air. Prax took an involuntary step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's moving," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The others stared at the pod in silence. The faint creak soon became sharper, more rhythmic. It was as though something, or someone, was shifting within, testing the confines of the small space. "Activate the secondary field," Virax ordered, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. Prax's hands trembled as he followed the command, inputting the sequence into the console. The energy shielding shimmered, doubling in strength around the pod, bathing the entire brig in a pale blue glow. But the creaking continued, almost as if the extra containment had no effect at all. "What's inside?" Renan muttered, his usual confidence wavering. "It shouldn't be able to move like that, not in that state." The pod let out a sudden metallic clang, the sound of something hard pressing against its walls. The noise reverberated through the room, causing all three of the Drathaki soldiers to flinch. Whatever was inside was growing more active. "It's trying to get out," Prax said, his voice shaky. He took another step back, his eyes darting between the pod and the controls. "Why isn't the field stopping it?" Virax gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "It shouldn't be possible. The field can contain creatures twice the strength of any known species in this sector. It can't break through." Another loud bang. This time it wasn't just the sound. It was the pod itself, shaking slightly, as if something was forcing the door open from within. The energy field flickered, struggling to contain whatever was inside. Renan cursed under his breath. "This wasn't part of the deal. It should have stayed dormant until the transport arrived." Prax's claws clicked against the metal floor as he backed further away. What if this is one of them?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rattling pod. Virax turned sharply to Prax, narrowing his eyes. "Stop with the superstition. There is no such thing. Whatever this is not one of those mythical creatures from your stories." But even Virax couldn't shake the unsettling feeling gnawing at his gut. The pod jerked violently again, another bang echoing through the chamber. Renan's hand hovered over the emergency alert switch. "Should we—" "Wait." Virax held up a hand. "Let's not jump to conclusions yet." The pod finally went still, the violent rattling ceasing as suddenly as it had started. Silence fell over the brig, heavy and oppressive. The three soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, their nerves on edge. "Is it over?" Prax asked, his voice barely a whisper. For a moment, no one answered. The pod remained motionless, the energy shields flickering softly around it. Then, without warning, a sharp hiss echoed through the room. The escape pod door opened, cold air escaping as the figure within stirred. The Drathaki soldier stood still, watching as the figure, a tall, muscular being with pale skin and unfamiliar features, emerged from the pod. Its eyes blinked against the artificial light of the brig, squinting as it took in the alien surroundings. For a long moment, the figure stood motionless, its breath steady but deep, as if struggling to orient itself. Its gaze flicked from the walls to the energy shield surrounding it, then to the creatures watching from outside the barrier. Confusion clouded his expression. Virax motioned to Prax, who tapped a sequence on the console, activating the translator field. The air hummed briefly, signaling the connection between the two languages. The figure's lips parted, his voice rough and low, tinged with uncertainty. "What? Where am I?" The words came slowly, as if the figure wasn't fully aware of what it was asking yet. Its gaze darted between the Drathaki, and it took a cautious step forward, stopping just short of the shimmering energy field. "Tell me, what is this place?" the figure demanded, its voice gaining strength. "What happened?" The translator processed the questions, the alien words rippling through the room. Virax exchanged a glance with Renan, unsure of how much they should reveal. The stories have spoken of creatures like this, but none of them had ever been confirmed. Renan leaned in, muttering under his breath. "Do we answer it?" Virax hesitated, then nodded. "We have no choice." Renan stepped forward, speaking slowly, so the translator could relay his words. "You crash-landed on Talavaran 9. We recovered you from your escape pod." The figure's eyes widened, processing the information. It raised a hand to its head, massaging its temples, as if trying to remember. Telavara 9? Never heard of it. His gaze sharpened suddenly. How long? How long have I been here? Prax, standing behind the console, quickly checked the readings. It's been 6 cycles since we found the pod. The figure's brow furrowed. It seemed to relax for a moment, as if the explanation was starting to make sense. But then its expression shifted, suspicion creeping in. So, you rescued me? Its eyes narrowed, scanning their faces. You're letting me go? The Drathaki were silent. The translator buzzed softly, the unanswered question hanging in the air. The figure waited, but when no response came, it took another step closer to the energy field, its confusion turning into frustration. I asked you if I'm free to leave. Renin cleared his throat, glancing nervously at Virax. You can't leave. The transport is coming, but until then you'll remain here. The figure stiffened, the tension in its body visible now. Remain here? His voice dropped, the rough edge sharpening. What are you saying? Am I a prisoner? No, Virax answered, trying to keep his voice steady. You're not a prisoner, but you cannot leave the planet until command arrives. The words were met with silence. The figure stood still, his gaze growing colder. It seemed to process everything slowly, connecting the dots in its mind. Then, his lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. I see. You're not rescuing me. You're detaining me. The translator's mechanical tone made the statement sound even harsher. The Drathaki shifted uneasily, the weight of the figure's words settling over them. Virax swallowed hard, trying to maintain control of the situation. We have protocols to follow. You're an unknown species. The figure interrupted, his voice suddenly calm but filled with an ominous edge. Unknown species? You don't even know what you're dealing with, do you? The tension in the room thickened. The figure looked at the energy field again, his eyes gleaming with something dark. You think this will hold me? That you can keep me here until your command decides what to do with me? Renin took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. Prax's claws trembled against the console, unsure of whether to raise the shields higher or wait for Virax's orders. The figure tilted his head slightly, his voice lowering to a quiet, dangerous whisper. Let me give you some advice, while you still have time. I'm not the only one you should be worried about. The translator buzzed as the words echoed through the chamber, but the weight of the statement hit them all at once. Prax's eyes widened, fear creeping into his expression. Virax, trying to maintain control, forced his voice to remain steady. What are you talking about? The figure's cold smile returned, but there was no humor in it. Others will come for me, and when they do, you'll wish you had let me go. Renin's hand hovered near the console, ready to trigger the alert. Is that a threat? No, the figure said softly, the calm in his voice more unsettling than any outburst. It's a promise. The brig was filled with a tense silence. The figure inside the energy field stood calmly, watching the Drathaki soldiers with a cold, unsettling gaze. It hadn't moved since his veiled threat, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Virax stood by the console, his eyes on the readings, though he couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up the back of his mind. Prax's nervous fidgeting, Renin's clenched jaw. Something had changed. Prax took a step back from the group, his gaze lingering on the figure. His claws flexed anxiously at his sides. We should have done something already, he muttered, barely loud enough for the others to hear. Renin shot a quick glance at him, then back at Virax. We're waiting for command, he said, though his voice lacked his usual confidence. That's the plan. Prax shook his head, his voice trembling. We don't know what this thing is. What What if it can break out? What if we're just sitting here? Virax didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the figure. The way it stood, still and calm, unnerved him. There was no panic, no fear, just patience. The figure's eyes shifted, resting on Prax. You don't trust your own people to protect you? Prax stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. He opened his mouth to reply, but the words didn't come. His eyes flicked nervously towards Virax, seeking assurance that never came. Renin stepped forward, his voice sharp. That's enough from you. But the figure's gaze remained locked on Prax. You think you're safe here, behind that barrier? You think your command will come in time? Prax's claws scratched against the console, his nerves fraying with each passing second. Maybe we should increase the shields, just in case. We don't need to, Virax said, though his voice sounded more controlled than certain. He glanced at the figure, his faint smile like a shadow that refused to leave the edges of his vision. It's contained. Prax took another step back, his breathing shallow. We can't take the chance. We don't know what we're dealing with. Renin turned, his face tense. Prax, calm down. But Prax wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were wide, fixed on the figure. We should have destroyed it when we had the chance. Now it's too late. The figure watched, silently, its smile widening just a fraction. It didn't need to say anything. Prax's panic was spreading. The fear thickened the air. Renin shot a glance at Virax, uncertainty flickering across his face. He's losing it. Virax shifted uncomfortably, his confidence in the situation slipping through his fingers. His eyes met Renin's briefly, then flicked back to the figure. It hadn't moved, but it might as well have. We stick to the plan, Virax said, more to himself than to anyone else. Command will be here. We hold position. The figure tilted his head slightly, observing them with a cold, calculating gaze. You're waiting for someone to save you. Isn't that ironic? Renin's claws curled into fists, his tension barely restrained. Shut it! The figure didn't react to the outburst. Instead, it shifted its gaze between Prax, Renin, and Virax, as if measuring something unseen. You're already questioning each other. You're afraid. Prax's breath hitched. His eyes darted to the console, then back to the energy field. Virax, what if it's right? What if command doesn't come in time? Virax's jaw tightened. They'll come. But the figure's smile remained, unsettling in its stillness. It said nothing more, letting the silence speak for it. Renin, standing closest to the console, cast a glance at Virax. And if it's not bluffing? Virax didn't respond immediately, his mind racing. The figure's calm, patient demeanor was unnerving. It was as though it knew something they didn't, something it was just waiting for them to realize. We don't panic, Virax said quietly, though his own words felt like they were slipping away. We don't lose control. But control was already slipping. The figure hadn't done anything, hadn't moved from its place within the field, yet somehow the room felt smaller, the air thicker with unspoken fears. The tension in the brig had reached a breaking point. Virax, sensing the growing instability within his team, took a deep breath and made a quick decision. Lock down the brig, he ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. No one in or out until command arrives. Prax froze, glancing nervously at Renin. What? We can't. Do it, Prax, Virax snapped, his eyes burning with authority. Now. Prax's claws fumbled over the control panel, initiating the lockdown sequence. The walls around the brig hummed with power as reinforced barriers slid into place, sealing the room completely. The lights dimmed slightly as the energy field around the cell surged to full capacity. There, Virax muttered, staring at the figure still standing calmly inside his containment. That should hold you. The figure's cold smile never wavered. It didn't move, but his gaze followed the soldiers as they left the room, his presence a shadow that lingered long after the door sealed shut. The base had grown unnervingly quiet since the lockdown. The walls seemed to hum with tension, and every creak of the structure made Prax jump. Virax had ordered a full containment of the Brig, and that should have reassured him. Should have. But the pit in Prax's stomach only grew deeper with each passing hour. The figure's words echoed in his mind, his calm smile, the unsettling confidence it had shown in the face of complete containment. "You're already questioning each other," it had spoken, as if it knew something they didn't, something important, and Prax couldn't shake the feeling that if he didn't find out what it knew, they were all doomed. He lay restless in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his claws fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. Virax had insisted Command would handle it, but what if they didn't? What if the figure knew something they didn't? What if it had knowledge that could save them, or destroy them? Driven by a growing sense of dread, Prax quietly slipped out of his quarters, glancing down the dark hallways to make sure no one was watching. His pulse quickened as he made his way back to the Brig, the tension thickening with each step. The lockdown was still in place, but Prax knew the override codes only the guards and engineers were supposed to know. He tapped in the sequence, his claws shaking as the Brig's outer door slid open. The energy fields buzzed faintly, their glow casting long shadows against the cold metal walls. Inside, the figure still stood, as if it had never moved since their last encounter. His eyes flicked to Prax, and a knowing smile crept across his lips. "You came back," the figure said softly. "Couldn't stay away, could you?" Prax hesitated, his heart racing. I need to know." The figure's smile widened, though it still didn't move from its position behind the energy field. Need to know what? Prax's claws gripped the edge of the console, his fear bubbling to the surface. "What do you know? What's coming?" The figure tilted his head slightly, studying Prax with a quiet intensity. "You're afraid." Prax flinched at the words, but didn't deny it. His eyes darted toward the door, then back to the figure. "You need to tell me. If you know something, if there's something we don't see coming, you need to tell me now." The figure's smile widened, his gaze intense. "Why are you so afraid, Prax?" Prax's breath hitched. He hadn't told the figure his name, and yet it knew. He took a step back, his claws trembling. "Just answer me. I need to know what's coming. You know something." The figure finally moved, taking a slow step forward, though the energy field held it in place. His eyes gleamed in the dim light. "You're scared because you don't trust your own command, don't you?" Prax shook his head, though the denial felt weak. "I trust command." The figure chuckled softly. "No, you don't. You wouldn't be here if you trusted them. You're here because you think they're wrong. Because you think I know something they don't." It paused, letting the silence stretch between them. "You think I can save you?" Prax's chest tightened, his mind swelling with doubts and fear. I need to know." The figure tilted his head again, his gaze calculating. "If I tell you what's coming, will you trust me?" Prax hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. Could he trust it? Could he afford not to? The figure's smile didn't fade. "Your command isn't coming in time, Prax. Something else is, and you're not ready." Prax's claws tightened around the console, his mind reeling. He had come here for answers, but the figure was giving him more questions. But one thing was clear. If he didn't do something, if he didn't find out what the figure knew, they were all in danger. Prax stood frozen, the figure's words swirling in his mind like a dark fog. Something else is coming. You're not ready. His heart raced as he stared into the cold, unblinking eyes of the figure behind the energy field. It hadn't moved to attack, hadn't even raised its voice, Yet the terror it instilled in Prax felt far more suffocating than any physical threat. Prax's claws twitched, his breath shallow. What do you mean we're not ready? Command is gone, the figure said, his voice steady, as though it were discussing something inevitable. They were destroyed days ago. Prax's throat tightened. Destroyed? No, they're just delayed. There's no way. The figure took a step closer to the edge of the field, the energy crackling faintly but holding firm. You know it's true. You've been waiting. How many cycles now? You expected them to arrive by now, but they haven't. Why? Prax's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling. He had clung to the hope that command would come, that the lockdown was just temporary. But as the cycles passed, doubt had crept in. And now, with the figure's words echoing in his mind, he couldn't ignore the cold, sinking realization. No, Prax whispered, more to himself than to the figure. They can be. The figure watched him, his gaze unwavering. You've been abandoned, Prax. Your hierarchy, the ones you trusted, they're gone. Wiped out. Prax stumbled back a step, his legs weak beneath him. His claws gripped the edge of the console, the weight of the situation crushing him. But how? The figure's eyes gleamed in the dim light, his voice soft but clear. The terrain isn't what you think it is. You thought you were safe here on Tellarava 9, but this planet isn't just another outpost. It paused, letting the silence deepen. It was a target. Prax's chest tightened. A target? The Armada came days ago, the figure continued, his calm demeanor only adding to the weight of its words. Your command was obliterated before they had a chance to respond, and now you're stranded. The reason no transport has come for you is because there's no one left to send it. Prax felt his legs give away, and he collapsed against the console, his breath shallow. No, that can't be true. Virax would know. He would have... Virax doesn't know, the figure interrupted, his voice a sharp whisper. He's clinging to protocol, following orders from a command that no longer exists. He's keeping you in the dark, hoping you won't see the truth. Prax's eyes widened, his heart pounding. If what the figure was saying was true, they were alone, completely alone. The figure took another step closer, his voice lowering to a near whisper. But you can still survive, Prax. You don't have to die here. Prax's breath hitched. What do I have to do? The figure's smile returned, faint but unsettling. Let me out. Prax's claws echoed around the console. Let it out? That was unthinkable. But if it was right, if command was truly gone and they were stranded, what choice did he have? The others didn't believe him. Virax had locked down the Brig, but Virax didn't understand. Prax was the only one who saw the truth now. He swallowed hard, his heart racing. If I let you out, you won't hurt us? The figure's smile widened slightly. You have my word. I don't need to hurt you, Prax. I'm offering you a chance to live. Prax hesitated, his mind spinning. Everything inside him screamed not to do it, but the fear, the crushing realization that they were already too late, pushed him forward. His claws hovered over the control panel, trembling. If you let me out, the figure said softly, you can still survive this. But if you don't, you'll die here, alone. Prax closed his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't have a choice. He tapped the sequence into the console, and with a soft hum, the energy field surrounding the figure deactivated. The barrier shimmered briefly before disappearing entirely. The Brig was still as Prax stared at the human, his body tense, heart pounding. The energy field was gone, and the human stood outside the containment area, free. Prax could hardly breathe, the weight of his fear crushing down on him. He had done it. He had let the human out. The human didn't move toward him. It didn't need to. Instead, it looked down at Prax, its gaze calm, almost pitying. There was no violence in this posture. No need for intimidation. It had already won. For a long moment, the two stood in silence. Then the human spoke, his voice low and steady, filled with a cold certainty that made Prax's scales twitch. "You've made the right choice, Prax," the human said, his tone almost gentle. "You did what you had to." Prax swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. What happens now?" The human smile was faint, but there was no warmth in it. Now you understand. You're smarter than the others. You saw the truth when they didn't." Prax's claws dug into the edge of the console, his breath shaky but determined. "I didn't have a choice. You said command is gone," the human finished, stepping forward just enough for his presence to be felt. "Wiped out days ago. They left you behind. You were never going to get that transport." Prax nodded weakly, trying to convince himself of the truth in the human's words. But doubt clawed at him, a nagging voice in the back of his mind that refused to go silent. He stared at the human, his breath shallow. "You're leaving?" The human straightened, his gaze shifting toward the door. "Yes, I've been here long enough." Prax's heart pounded, fear surging through his chest. You said I'd live." The human looked down at him, his expression unreadable. "You will. I don't need to hurt you." Prax blinked, his mind racing with uncertainty. He had freed this thing based on the promise, but now he felt more lost than ever. What if command comes? The human smile returned, cold and knowing. He stepped closer, standing over Prax, his voice barely above a whisper. "They won't." Prax's breath caught in his throat. "But they've already failed you," the human said, his tone calm but final. "That's why you're still here. You were left behind, abandoned. Don't waste your time hoping they'll come." Prax stared up at the human, the weight of those words sinking in. Had he really been abandoned? Was the transport never coming? His mind swelled with confusion and doubt, every thought pulling him deeper into fear. The human crouched down to Prax's level, its eyes locking onto his. "You're smarter than them, Prax. You saw the truth, but now it's too late for them. You did what you needed to survive." Prax's claws dug into the metal beneath him, his breathing shaky. I don't know." The human's voice was quiet, almost comforting. "Yes, you do. You did the right thing." It stood up, slowly, turning toward the door. Just as it was about to leave, it paused, casting one last glance back at Prax. "Remember this. Survival isn't about following orders. It's about knowing when to make the right choice." With that, the human walked away, leaving Prax alone in the brig, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a mountain. He had let the human go. It was his only option. The heavy hum of the transport's engines filled the air as it descended toward the base on Talavara 9. Captain Jalar, a seasoned Drathaki officer, watched the landing procedure from the control deck, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain below. The base, one of many scattered across the hostile planet, appeared quiet. Too quiet. The base had sent out a signal requesting support several cycles ago, but since then there had been nothing. No updates, no further communication. That in itself was odd, but Jalar had dealt with worse in his years of service. His instincts, however, told him something wasn't right. "Status report," Jalar barked, his voice carrying authority. "Touchdown in 3 minutes," one of his crew responded from the pilot's seat. "Base appears to be fully operational. No visible damage or threats detected." Jalar narrowed his eyes at the screen. The reports had been unclear, but something had driven this team to send a distress signal. As the transport prepared to land, he made a quick decision. "Team Beta, prepare for immediate disembark. We're heading straight to the command center." The transport ship touched down with a soft thud, its massive landing gear settling into the rocky ground. The landing ramp lowered, and Jalar, flanked by a dozen soldiers, marched down into the still air of Talavara 9's atmosphere. His eyes swept across the base, noting the eerie silence that hung in the air. Where was everyone? The team advanced through the empty corridors of the base, their footfalls echoing off the metal walls. It didn't take long for them to reach the brig. As they approached, the door slid open, revealing the cold, empty space beyond. Jalar's sharp gaze immediately fell on the signs of recent activity. An override on the security panel, the containment field deactivated. "Something happened here," Jalar muttered, his tone sharp. One of his officers stepped forward, checking the console. "The brig was accessed a cycle ago. Containment field was deactivated. Cell is empty." Jalar's eyes narrowed. "Where's the prisoner?" There was a pause as the officer scanned the logs, his scales rippling in confusion. It was released. Manual override from inside the base." Jalar's jaw tightened, his mind racing. "Released? By whom?" Just then, the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed from the far corridor. Jalar's hand instinctively went to his weapon as a figure appeared. A disheveled Drathaki, his scales dull and his eyes wide with a strange, unnerving calm. Prax. Jalar's eyes narrowed as Prax approached, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were carrying the weight of something immense. His face was eerily serene, which unsettled Jalar even more. "What happened here?" Jalar asked, his voice cold and demanding. "Where is the prisoner?" Prax stopped a few feet away, his eyes locking onto Jalar's. "It's gone," he said simply. Jalar's claws tightened. "Gone? Who released it?" Prax's gaze didn't falter. "I did." The room fell into a stunned silence. Jalar's soldiers exchanged horrified glances, the weight of what Prax had just admitted settling over them like a dark cloud. "You did what?" Jalar's voice was low, sharp with disbelief. Prax's expression remained calm, his voice steady. "I released it. Command was gone. There was no transport coming. We were abandoned." Jalar's heart pounded in his chest. "Command is not gone. We're here. You sent a distress signal and we responded." Prax blinked, the calmness in his eyes unshaken. "The human told me. Command had fallen. It said we were left behind." Jalar stepped forward, his anger boiling over. "You released it based on the word of a prisoner? Of a creature we don't even understand?" Prax's expression didn't change. "It told me the truth. I had no choice." Jalar stared at him, his fury mixing with disbelief. "You've compromised this entire operation. You put every one of your team members at risk." Prax shook his head slowly. "No. The human didn't need to harm us. It wanted to survive, just like us. I did what was necessary." Jalar stared at him, his disbelief deepening with every passing second. "You'll explain yourself to command." Without another word, Jalar gestured to his team, and two soldiers moved to restrain Prax, their faces filled with disgust and disbelief. As they led him away, Prax's calm demeanor never wavered. He had made his choice. He had seen the truth. But as Jalar watched him disappear down the corridor, his anger burned. Prax's decision had endangered them all, and now they had to deal with the consequences.